I had a question come up recently on my Patreon, and it was a question about my opinion on unique or little known mediums, and if I have any favorites myself. So I wanted to go ahead and answer this question by William S. and see where it takes us. So, my opinion on unique or little known mediums. I am an easily excitable person. So, running into a new medium, something that is not something that I've spent time with before, not something I did in school, in my undergrad at university, or even in my professional experience, is always a little captivating. And for me, the most recent one that I can remember is gouache. I went to school, literally went to art school, and I only ever heard of gouache because I had one illustration professor who talked about that being the thing he worked in. Ironically, he never talked about gouache at all. He never talked to us about what it was. He never showed us how to use it. He never brought it in. And so I got about 10 years into my professional career teaching art before I realized what gouache was. And for those of you who don't know, it's basically an opaque watercolor. So if you like working with watercolor, but you hate how the layering works with it, or you find that you struggle with that, then gouache might be a good solution for you. It's got some idiosyncrasies that I'm not going to talk about here too much, but that just to William's question, this was a really awesome thing to run into because it felt like, oh my goodness, this is watercolor that I know and love so much, but I can do white highlights over the top of dark areas, and that felt magical. And that's kind of how I feel about new mediums. When I run into unique or new mediums, I get really excited because they offer new ways to interface with art, new things that I can do. I've been working in art in some capacity for 30 years now, and I taught it professionally for 11. So I don't run into new mediums all too frequently. But I suppose, honestly, if I started searching for them, I probably would. Another one just popped up in my mind, actually. Another two. Oh, goodness. So maybe this will be some more rambles. Acrylic paint markers and pens are a really recent thing for me to run into. They're awesome for signing things because I can go back over an oil or an acrylic painting and put them on top, and it's nice and lustrous. But also, like, they're really cool just for making paintings with. So they are, like, Posca is the brand that most people know of when it comes to these things. And they're basically, you're drawing with acrylic paint. So it's like a Sharpie, except it actually leaves more residue on top. So again, you can do light colors on top of dark colors, and they're so much fun to work with. I've done whole pieces in them. I've augmented things with them. I've gone over ink pieces. I've done backgrounds with them and done ink on top, and they've been so much fun to work with. And probably my favorite in the last couple years has been the brush pens that I do so much work here on the channel, especially the early podcasts were just giant pieces that were all brush pen. And brush pens were something that I didn't know about. Brush markers, sometimes people will call them. And honestly, the little brush pen, the ink brush pen that you see appearing in this video, these are mediums that by and large are new to me. And some of them I just clicked with immediately. I clicked with the Posca paint markers really fast, but this guy, this ink brush pen took me forever. I got it, I spent a couple days working with it, was like, this is just not for me. Came back to it a year or so later and realized it was my fine motor skills that were not up to the task. And so as I continued to play with it and learn about it, I became more proficient and it was way more enjoyable to work with. So yes, to this question, William, I really like finding new mediums because they all offer something different, something new that you can interface with. And it's such a lovely thing. So thank you for that question. But we are not done with this session because I want to talk about the fact that I am still making robots. So I finished my robot series. That video is up on the channel. I'll actually link it for you here so you can see it. But I made 100 of these robots and then didn't know what I was going to do with myself. And I just accidentally started making more robots, which is fine. I enjoy them. I really enjoy drawing these little guys. They're so curious to me in how they're put together, and I keep growing as I invest the time. But I wanted to talk a little bit here about what's actually going on. So this drawing is a good example of me having little to no plan at the beginning. You saw that I got my red pencil and I started just drawing some shapes. I felt like I wanted to do something that was more cylindrical and maybe something that was going into the background because the two that came before this were pretty simple, just little characters. They were also just the second page in this sketchbook, and so I was trying to keep my stress levels low. I didn't want it to be a really difficult thing for me as I'm diving into the new book. So I gave myself some pretty good lines here, and then I started just to work on the shapes. When I set things up with ink and I don't know exactly what I'm going to be doing, you'll notice that I move forward as I did here, where I will give myself some lines that are totally crisp and that are really long, but I won't fill in every gap. I'm allowing myself to make decisions later on. So like the fact that I left little gaps there allows me to do these legs. It's going to allow me to do seams. It's going to allow me to do other things because ink's permanent. Once it goes down, it's there. There's not a lot that you can do to mess with it, though. As I was talking about the Poscas earlier, you can't actually use an acrylic marker sometimes to like fill in some of those gaps. I don't do it often, but it is a possibility. But tangent aside, I like to leave myself little gaps in things because I don't know exactly what decision I'm going to make. It's pretty easy to go back in later and fill in spaces that I left. I have a tendency to make things pristine if I'm not paying attention. You know, the sides of that piece of metal are just perfect, and nothing really looks perfect like that unless it was just built. In fact, if you look at old science fiction movies before Star Wars, like The Last Starfighter, for example, everything feels too pristine. But when you watch Star Wars, part of what makes it so believable is all the crafts. The Corvette at the beginning, the Star Destroyer, the X-Wings. All of the things in Star Wars, especially A New Hope, feel like they're old. They feel like they're run down, like they've seen use. And that's part of what is so believable about that world. It's one of the things that when you read Tolkien or when you watch the Lord of the Rings movies, it feels believable because the world feels lived in. Not everybody knows all the secrets about every single thing that exists, right? You know, you stumble into something and you're like, I don't know what this is, and the characters are going, I don't know what this is either. When you play Breath of the Wild, it has that same aspect to it, or any Dark Souls game or Elden Ring or Bloodborne. They all have this aspect to them of, this is a world that is unknowable in its totality. And the reason that feels realistic to us is because that's how our world is. There are whole civilizations that we are just learning about, and some that we may never know about in any way, shape, or form. And that's scary and beautiful and mysterious in so many ways. So, all that to say that I've learned over the process of making these robots, especially robots, that allowing things to be imperfect, making weird shading decisions on them, dents, little chinks in the armor or the metal, makes the whole thing seem more realistic and more interesting. So when I'm laying out my baseline shapes, I will often leave gaps that I can easily fill in later if I need to, but that give me the ability to make things feel a little bit more realistic, to make it feel like this robot wasn't built yesterday, it's actually existed for some quantity of time. That fuels some of the decisions as I'm moving forward on things. As I get kind of to the end stages though, like I am right now, you might notice that the red lines are still visible. That bothers me, and I have a tendency to try to erase them earlier than I should, but the reality is I have to wait until the drawing is totally dry, otherwise I'm gonna smudge my ink. I have a lot of things like that with my drawings that require my patience, and I'm not always very good about it. But they're things that you learn because you make that mistake once, and then you kind of hate on yourself for a little while before you realize, oh, this is a really easy strategy to adopt moving forward to avoid that kind of thing again. You might also notice that with the first two robots, they kind of just exist on the page. They've got shadows, yes, but as I move forward, I continue to add more environmental elements. I continue to add little bits of hatching here and there because those are the things that make it more believable, that make it more interesting. They give it that kind of longevity. And what I mean by that is the ability to look at it for more than just a few seconds. Because a lot of pieces of art, it's pretty easy to just look at them for a few seconds and go, that was cool, but now I'm going to move on to something else. The longer I go with this series, the longer I keep at these ink drawings, the more intriguing they become. I keep adding more details, but more than that, I'm figuring out how to add details in interesting ways. And that has been a lovely thing about this process. Right now, I'm kind of just finishing up the last couple details on here, making sure I have shading where I want there to be shading, making sure that I've filled in gaps where I need to. And I've started adding a lot of these tiny little lines because it fills in a little bit of that empty space. Well, thanks for hanging out while I answered that question earlier, and also while I worked on this robot, on robot 103. Except I think it's actually 104 because I don't think I did my math right, but I'll get it all together at some point. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support, as well as my other patrons, including the one who asked the question that spurred on this sketchbook session. If you want to check out the Patreon, there's a link down below. If you want to join a Discord server attached to this channel where we work together on honing our crafts and just becoming a community, there's a link to that below as well. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.